Forget frequently asked questions,
common sense, common knowledge, or Google.
How about advice from a real genius? 95% of people in any profession are good enough to be qualified and licensed. 5%
go above and beyond.
They become very good at what they do, but only
0.1%
are real geniuses. Richard Jacobs has made it his life's mission to find them for you. He hunts down and interviews geniuses in every field: sleep science, cancer, stem cells, ketogenic diets, and more. Here come the geniuses. This is the Finding Genius Podcast
with Richard Jacobs.
Before we begin, a note from our sponsor. I'm Richard Jacobs, Executive Director of the nonprofit Finding Genius Foundation and host of the Finding Genius Podcast. In late 2016, I was rear-ended at 65 miles an hour by a truck on the highway, which sent me off-road into a ditch. The impact of the collision gave me a concussion and other injuries. At the hospital, a CT scan showed that I had thyroid nodules, which turned out to be cancer. It was then, when I had a biopsy of my neck, that I realized even if I was a millionaire, I wouldn't want a second or a third biopsy due to the pain and the invasiveness of it. And appointments at that time for thyroid experts were 3 to 6 months out. And I was worried about dying now, even if that was irrational. So because of this, I've decided to raise money to conduct a literature review on steroids, on the causes of anxiety and depression, a condition that affects well over 50 million people in the United States and hundreds of millions worldwide. Our goal is to create a codex, a guide that reveals all possible treatments for anxiety and depression for people that live with the condition, or for loved ones that have it, as my wife and my son do. To find out more about our fundraiser, visit findinggeniusfoundation.org and click on current initiatives. And now to our guest.
Hi, this is Richard Jacobs with the Finding Genius podcast, now part of the Finding Genius Foundation. I have Véronique Tomaszewski. She's a pre-licensed clinician in her 5th year at the Gestalt Toronto clinic and a member of the Canadian Association of Psychodynamic Therapy. We're going to talk about anxiety and depression and self-worth. So Véronique, thank you for coming.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting me, Richard.
If you would tell me a bit about your background, why are you interested in anxiety and depression? Like, how did you get to where you are?
Okay, so my philosophy of life is that knowing without a direct experience is not really knowing completely. It's not really knowing. So I have experience in my family, among friends, of depression and anxiety when I was younger, but also in my work as a psychosociologist, teaching and training students at university. I noticed that their mental health was deteriorating. And we're talking about 18 to 24-year-old emerging adults. And I realized that I really wanted to support their mental health more than teach them social psychology and psychosociology. So I trained with the Gestalt Institute, and I'm now actually supporting these adults to help them manage and come out of depression and anxiety.
Things changed dramatically since COVID started, or has it been the past year and a half?
Yes, actually it started, I would say the last 10 years, there's been a major degradation of young adults' mental health. So at a university college, in New York University, we went from 1% of students needing mental health support to about 10%. And it's very consistent with other studies at other universities all throughout North America.
What do you think has been driving the degradation of mental health in young people for the past 10 years?
So there's a long list, actually, of issues that emerging adults are facing. There is, for a lot of them, divorce in the family, years of, let's say, fights between parents in some cases. They also display, some of them report being abused, bullied, either by classmates or by teachers themselves. There's issues in terms of gender, also finding one's identity, gender identity, sexual identity, and some of them find their sense of self, and they've been rejected. And there's also a lot, what we see in North America is, of course, students from First Nation indigenous families where there is intergenerational trauma. The list is quite long. So yeah, those are, I would say, are major areas. So they are either, and in some cases you have also epigenetics, which is when the parents themselves suffer from a mental illness, from anxiety, depression, OCD, ADHD, and or substance abuse, alcoholism, and drugs. And so the children grow up in an environment where they either display themselves some genetic confluence with the parents or some behavioral confluence, and they themselves develop some addictive behaviors. And they consult us also because it's really impossible for them to focus, to pay attention, to study. And they are really very worried, of course, about their possibility to even just lead their life. And then the last thing I want to say is also a huge, across the spectrum, anxiety about the future and the environmental degradation of the planet. That is actually something that is growing up. In the subconscious as a fear of the unknown. And then if you add the COVID crisis, of course, then you have a recipe for disaster.
What about social media? That seems to have been on the rise for the past 10 years. Do you ascribe any problems to that?
Well, social media are definitively an issue, especially for girls, for instance, who compare themselves physically, the look of their body, fat, do they eat, they don't eat, disordered eating symptoms. We see that. There's also the FOMO, the fear of missing out, that you see in this younger population. And but I would say that these are more treatable in a way with some CBT, some cognitive behavioral therapy, and also quite a number of initiatives that exist at high school level now and middle school. But it's true absolutely that it adds to that explosive cocktail, right?
So do you actively counsel people yourself, or are you studying the effects of these phenomena? Like what do you do today? What's your role?
I do both, and I do counsel a very large population on a daily basis and a weekly basis, yes. So I have a direct experience with emerging adults and one clinic, and as a counselor, I also treat other patients at adult clinics outside the academic environment.
So what are you noticing from your clinical work? What are you seeing in young people? And
so what I see is an incredible need to be heard. The very first step towards healing is to have someone listening to them. And this seems to be lacking. There's a tremendous sense of isolation and loneliness that may be the outcome of COVID, but it's also the outcome of being raised without parents. The two are working, and it's getting more difficult. There's no mom or dad. In some higher, upper middle class families, there are nannies, but they are not very present to the emotional and psychological needs of those children who grow into very, very sensitive, fragile young adults. And then with my other patients who are older, we still unearth quite a number of unfinished trauma, business from also, the teenage years.
So what kind of help is needed for teenagers so they don't grow up fragile and a mess?
So I will say that it's really essential. So, when we realized how at the societal level, we moved away from intergenerational families. And then you still see that, I have less Asian patients, for instance, because in those families, there's grandpa, grandma, uncles and aunts, and then everybody lives under the same household. Then actually it's easier for a child to regulate emotions and feelings, or find someone who will listen, who will hold a hand or give an opinion or feedback. And so it's a little bit easier. But in families, monoparental families, for instance, it's really difficult. So I will say that what is needed is different for these younger adults than for the older ones, who are often in relationships and have children and have colleagues at work. For the younger population, the need is really physical presence, sometimes not talking much, but being there and to reassure. Because there's actually, at a younger age, in terms of, psychological needs, there's a need to feel physically connected to someone else. This is, as adolescents, there's a need for peer approval. There's peer pressure. They need to gravitate in groups with one another and feel each other's presence. And then during the COVID lockdown and different confinements that we've been experiencing, it's been really impossible for many of these youth to actually connect physically or simply share the same space and share activities, meals with others. And this has exacerbated their fragile states of mind, their anxiety, their depression, and in some cases, substance abuse.
Before we continue, I've been personally funding the Finding Genius podcast for 4.5 years now, which has led to 2,700 plus interviews of clinicians, researchers, scientists, CEOs, and other amazing people who are working to advance science and improve our lives and our world. Even though this podcast gets 100,000 plus downloads a month, we need your help to reach hundreds of thousands more worldwide. Please visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click on Support Us. We have 3 levels of membership from $10 to $49 a month, including perks such as the ability to see ahead in our interview calendar and ask questions of upcoming guests, transcripts of podcasts you're interested in, the ability to request specific topics or guests, and more. Visit findinggeniuspodcast.com and click Support Us today. Now back to the show.
Do you feel like the therapy you're doing in the clinic is helping, or it's more of a Band-Aid with the current situation?
So the way I work, and I find that I'm having some results actually, the way I work is very embodied, and that's what is exactly needed. So I'm bringing different modalities. I'm bringing my Gestalt training, where it's about establishing contact at the contact boundary and providing support for the patients to be able to connect to themselves, to either their sense of shame or isolation, loneliness, anxiety, fear, whatever arises. And then in this particular case, I use experiments, be role-playing, the third chair, talking to the toxic parent or talking to the toxic teacher who was abusive. We use many different techniques, but the idea, for me, it's not an idea, but the practice is embodiment to ground oneself into one's body, into the present moment. Because the work we do is in the present moment. There is no need, like in psychoanalysis, to explore the past, because the perception we have of the past is how we feel about it today. And then we work in the present moment. I'm using also modalities, using the arts, for instance, writing, singing, also techniques like borrowed from psychodrama, so we can embody a character, and using paradoxical theory, like pushing further the contact, the style used by someone who was abusive, or, some psychodrama modalities are very useful when there is a lot of shame. So, for instance, shame around race, ethnicity, shame around some disability, could be a mental or physical disability, shame about poverty, coming from a very poor family and being the first one to go to university on a scholarship. There are so many different, and shame about one's body also. So embodying, connecting to all the senses, having a holistic, really contact as best as possible, allows to little by little unearth, how patient, deal with what I'm trying to hide, or move away from. I want to move away from pain and suffering. I don't want to touch what's going on in my body right now. So, I can be, I'm just talking in the first person here as being like a patient, right? Fidgeting, crying, being very agitated, talking a lot, forgetting to breathe. And so my work often starts with some mindfulness exercises. Let's breathe. Let's bring your mind into your body with me now in the space that we're sharing in that moment.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
And then we start from there, and I apply these different modalities.
So what kind of research are you engaged in? What are you trying to answer on the research side?
So it's interesting you're asking this question, because even though I'm a clinician and I'm really, really focused on healing, helping others heal, I find that after many years of work and gathering testimonies of those young adults, there is a huge need to reform education. There's a huge need to provide to teachers, educators, a training that is more holistic, that allow them to be intersubjective and not treat students, pupils, kids, different ages, even in high school,
From my own understanding, I mean, interpersonal relationships is not taught in any school. So, I mean, the people that are teachers, I would think that if you said to them, you know, you need to address these psychological issues, they would say, well, I'm not a psychologist, or I'm a math teacher, or I'm a this, I'm a that. So what do you do?
Exactly. So, Richard, it's not about telling them to treat mental health issues. It's allowing them to connect with students, not just through the knowledge that they transmit to a student, but also through being co-present in this relationship between student and teacher. The relationship itself is where the healing happens, even without doing anything, just being present to someone. And you know, I was taking an example. I have a student who is taking a lot of substances, trying to deal with severe anxiety. When he was in grade 2, he was ridiculed and shamed in front of everyone by the math teacher who told him he could never do math, who was really treating him with such, bullying him so much that he internalized that he was a failure, and it's been self-destructive since. So the idea is to find a way to reach out to those who want to teach, who want to be teachers, and allow them to process their own connection in the relationship between teacher and student, to allow them to hone somehow the quality of their presence, so that there's more respect, there's more collaborative work, there's a real presence. And that's very difficult, because then that would mean also that, for some teachers who themselves are just passing on the bullying that they experienced when they were younger, right? It would be a soul searching, or it would require them to also question what kind of teacher I am, not just what do I teach, but what kind of teacher, what is this extra quality that I can bring in my classroom when I deal with my students.
Why would the teachers care? What benefit would it be to them? What benefit, do they care that the students do better? Would they see that if they act in a certain way? And again, why would they care? Just to be harsh.
It's true. Why would they care? It's a good question. I believe they care. I believe there's some ethos as being a teacher, and maybe what could be brought to teachers' college in education is that asking, why do you want to be a teacher? And then is it because you have a stable job with a good pension? And also putting the emphasis. So, you are actually influencing and having an impact on the students that you're going to teach. That's a certain level of responsibilization. And why would they care? Well, it's true. Maybe I'm idealizing a little bit the relationship that it could be and the motivation that teachers would have. But I strongly believe that they would care if we show to them that they will benefit personally also from this, that a better quality of relationship between student and teacher allow them to grow as well individually as persons. So it's a win-win situation.
Yeah, no, that's true. I mean, you would hope that they have the best interest of their students in mind. I mean, it seems like you'd have to make a very simple toolkit that would overcome probably the intrinsic barriers mentally that these teachers have. Again, like,
yes,
they tell us what to do all day long. Will I get in trouble for doing this? Or again, yes. I'm not a psychologist. I'm a math teacher. What things have you found that the teachers maybe are, they believe that they shouldn't believe, or you have to overcome, et cetera? Like, what have you observed?
Well, there was an experimentation that was done, right, from the 1960s to the 1990s at University of Santa Barbara, I believe, or Santa Clara, in California. I think it was Santa Barbara, with the SLM Institute. And they brought Gestalt modalities to education at teachers training. And it was a success at that time, because it did train teachers who, through the training, felt better as persons. And they were, gaining a lot in terms of their own personal growth and own personal development. And so we have a lot of data that it can really, really work well, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I really think I'm not idealist when I say that. See, because...
Well, I mean, is this something where you'd have to get the administration to tell the teachers, this is what we're going to do, we support you, we encourage you, or could it come from the teacher level?
Yep. Actually, the administration is willing to offer one extra course or to modify the way some courses are offered at Teachers College, right? If they can really boost the image of the university after that, or the teaching program, by having only, award-winning teachers display, extraordinary qualities in their teaching, and that falls back on the reputation of the university. But for me, even though this is something I really want to push in a way, it's a much larger goal. The larger goal is that, I have some teachers coming also to the clinic as patients themselves, right? And not as teachers, but are beings who need help too. So the larger goal is to build a happier, more peaceful society at large, way beyond education. But it seems that education is the very first mold that we all go through. And the idea is that with consistency in providing a better quality of education, we can build a better society. We can build better social connections, relationships, better companies and working environments. That's what I feel. I feel that education is not the end of the journey. It's a kind of a path towards the rest of one's life and unfolding and becoming a better social actor and a better, well-rounded person, a whole person who can self-regulate better. And then, of course, the ramifications are large, in society. Like if there's less addiction, it costs less money also, because you need to run those addiction programs and rehabilitation centers. And if there's less anxiety and depression, there are also less suicides. And you have many more families who would be happier to still have their child or husband or wife or friend around, right? So everything is interconnected. Everything is codependent on each other. And since education is what makes us move out of our families into a kind of a waiting room until we are in the wild world at large, the world of work, of all other activities, I think that's why my attention is kind of brought towards that very, very important rite of passage.
The work that you're doing clinically is one person at a time, although I'm sure you're helping many people. How do you amplify this and get this out to a whole bunch more people? Have you thought about any strategies, or what do you think?
Well, it's my vision. My vision is, yes, it's one person at a time, but that person is a network in herself or himself or themselves. Think about youth. You have people around you, So when you interact with friends, with family members, with co-workers, with colleagues, with clerk at the supermarket, what you present then, right, will have an influence. We know when there's road rage and someone comes out of the car and punches someone else in the nose, that, obviously there are some issues here that need to be addressed, but there's kind of a domino effect also of when someone is not able to self-regulate or control oneself, then we see the consequences. When everything works well and everybody's happy, content, going after their activities and so on, we're maybe less aware of the influence we have on others because it works well. So I would say that my vision is that one person at a time is like one drop in the ocean is essential, because when you add all the different drops, you have a whole ocean, all the drops of water. So it's about the same. In life, yes, one person, but one person matters because one person is in connection with many other people, and that will have a domino effect and ramifications around. So that's why I have faith in that kind of work. But also, I've also led group workshops in mindfulness, and where I was coaching a group of 6-8 people at a time. And I can tell you that the synergy between the group members is also something very important. So that works too. But I would not discard, the one-on-one therapy sessions. I find that the good effect it has, benefits all the family members, the entire environment around the person. And when the person changes, the environment changes around that person.
How much of an intergenerational effect do you see alcoholism all kinds of other behaviors having on teens?
Well, first of all, alcoholism in its phenomenology, which is in actually how it plays out, right, is not affecting just, let's say, a parent who's alcoholic, but it's affecting the children growing up with a very absent parent. When a parent is drinking and gets drunk, the parent is displaying suffering and also a certain hopelessness about it. So that affects the children, but also is very absent to the needs of a child growing up with an alcoholic parent. So the child comes back from school, was bullied, but the parent is drunk and cannot really listen to what's going on, and there's no support. And when a child or children grow in an environment with alcoholic parents, what we see once they become adult and they consult, when they consult me, for instance, they are displaying symptoms of severe abandonment syndrome, difficulty to attach, a broken self, not knowing oneself because there was no real interaction with a parent helping to grow and go through major milestones from childhood to adolescence and up. So these are the kind of consequences for someone to grow up in an alcoholic family. And then you can add to that in some cases when the alcoholic parent is aggressive and then abuses the child physically, then we have to deal with physical trauma then and a person. So it's not just psychologically a feeling of abandonment, of being invisible, of not knowing oneself, but sometimes there are also physical scars from having been beaten up or abused, and sometimes it's really atrocious form of abuse. There's also difficulty in trusting others when alcoholic parents fight and beat each other in front of the children. So you see how dramatic it is. And then we're talking about, one alcoholic parent, for instance, right? And the consequences it has. So when we look at First Nation and Indigenous situation here, for instance, in Canada, you see that an alcoholic, I'll take the example of I have a patient whose mother is alcoholic and she's First Nation and she's a survivor of residential schools. And how she herself, now as she's 24, is drinking. And so the transgenerational trauma is exactly that, which is growing up without knowing what to do when I don't feel well, and then subconsciously adopting parents' behavior. So if mom was calming down when she was drinking and being drunk and she would leave me alone and stop yelling at me, then when I drink, I can get the same escape and feel like, oh my God, and then this way I can numb the pain, right? And so that's how it's transmitted. And of course, then we need intervention. And we need intervention from a holistic perspective, healing the body, healing the heart, healing the mind, and with First Nation, healing the spirit also. If something is broken in the sense of the spiritual identity, which is part of the identity of an Indigenous person.
Well, very good. Véronique, what's the best place for people to find out more about your work? Where can they go?
Good question. So our podcast is actually probably the first stop when it comes to social media. I'm doing my work with the clinics, with the institutions I work with, and I haven't yet published in this area. And I'm considering maybe offering some YouTube videos in the future. But for now, I would say that, it's still the onset, right, of a large public presence. So I really appreciate the opportunity you gave to me.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, it was excellent to talk to you. And thank you for coming on the podcast. I appreciate it.
You're welcome, Richard.
If you like this podcast, please click the link in the description to subscribe and review us on iTunes.
You've been listening to the Finding Genius podcast with Richard Jacobs. If you like what you hear, be sure to review and subscribe to the Finding Genius podcast on iTunes or wherever you listen to podcasts. And want to be smarter than everybody else? Become a premium member at findinggeniuspodcast.com. This podcast is for information only. No advice of any kind is being given. Any action you take or don't take as a result of listening is your sole responsibility. Consult professionals when advice is needed.